Kaur's daughter, co-chair of this series. We have the honor and a great privilege today of hearing from Anjali Kaur. It's going to be such a big deal. I heard from last night, and she's fabulous, and she is really going to give us a much more detailed history of her big polio. She's an advocacy and resource mobilization specialist at UNICEF Polio Program, which is one of the key partners in the Global Health Initiative Eradication Program, which is one of the largest evidence-based initiatives indicating the global health changes in the world today. Angela has worked, I said, is it over 6 years with polio? Over 6 years with polio. She's worked in a number of different countries. She's worked in the United States. She's worked in India and Brazil. She's worked with the World Bank. She's worked with the United Nations Population Fund, Earth Institute, and countless other local and global NGOs. The Earth Institute is a number of services and model of health programs and demonstrate that it's possible to achieve ambitious health goals in this case through vaccination coverage, even in areas with deep health systems. And so again, this is going to tell us how a lot of the lessons learned from dealing with polio can now be used to make the goal. Anjali was a bachelor's and a master's from Johns Hopkins University. She's a Fulbright scholar. She speaks 5 languages. She speaks English. She speaks Hindi. She speaks Portuguese, Punjab, and Spanish. So please join me now and give me a really, really warm welcome to our church.
Hello everyone. I'm actually going to not stand behind the podium because it's easier for me to see everybody from a different angle and to move around with the slides as well. So, let me just push that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction. That was great, really kind, and I'm really excited to be here with all of you. And I was saying this last night too, is that it's a great opportunity to be able to take you on our journey because we rely on each and every one of you to take our story forward, to understand our efforts, to utilize what we have learned and to be able to pass that on to others, to other initiatives, and to other people to motivate them, not only in terms of what UNICEF's doing and to support UNICEF, but to support children's health as a whole and the importance of what it takes to make sure a child is healthy, and especially those first 5 years of their lives. So it's a super important gathering, I think, to be able to have people around the room that believe in the same cause and that want to learn more so that you can go forward to your other circles and to your friends and to your family and to be able to talk about this as well. So thank you. So I just want to give you a quick run through in terms of PowerPoint, in terms of what polio is, what UNICEF does, why we do it, specifically on polio, and then I really want to open it up in terms of question and answers and be able to address what you've been hearing about polio and what your concerns are and the questions that you may have in terms of the program and the disease and what's happening around the world around it, right? So UNICEF basically joined this Global Polio Eradication Initiative, the GPEI, in 1988. And at this point, we're a part of the partnership with WHO, with the Gates Foundation, with Rotary International, with CDC, and UNICEF. And then we've got peripheral partners who also really help a great deal. At this point in the world, you are seeing all the countries that are infected with polio. This leads to 350,000 cases in over 100 countries. And this is the point of where the world looks like in 1988. And then we get to what we've done over the past 35 years. This is 2014, and this is how we open up 2015 as well, where we have 3 infected countries, and the rest of the world is polio-free at this point. And so we like to say we're closer than we think. We have eradicated or become polio-free in 99% of the world, and so it's 1% that's left. And so to be able to take you back so you understand what that 1% is, because so many people come up to me and say, I don't know what polio looks like anymore. And why polio? Because I can see the impact of measles, or I can see so many other things. And it really takes remembering what happened in the U.S. and what polio was like in the U.S. for you to really understand how grave it is and was. So the first U.S. polio outbreak was in 1843. And people will remember the iron lungs. And especially around 1940 and 1950, we had 35,000 cases. And I always like to relate this back to Ebola. The scare that you're having around Ebola right now and people were having over the past several months is exactly, or even more so, what was existing in the U.S. in the 1940s and 50s, and in Europe as well. And it was the same type of scenario. It wasn't that any neighborhood was necessarily free from the scare of polio. It happened to the rich and poor, the clean and the dirty areas, wherever you could find it. The pools were closed. I mean, we spoke about this yesterday in terms of people's experiences in Kathy's book. And, nobody knew what was going to happen until the vaccine was discovered. And when the two vaccines were discovered in the 50s, children and parents were lining up around the corners of the street. March of Dimes had a huge campaign to be able to support this. It was a big deal. It was a huge feat to be able to find an answer to a disease that was devastating for large populations across the country. So since then, vaccinations began in 1955, and we've been polio-free since 1979 in the U.S. And I like to relate this to the fact that the only other disease that's ever been eradicated in the world is smallpox. And smallpox was eradicated in 1980. And to think about the fact that as a global public health initiatives across the world, we have not been able to get rid of any other disease with the kind of talent, money, innovations, technology that exists is unfortunate to all of us. So that is another reason that all of us believe that this ambitious health goal of eradicating polio is something that's within our means and within our generation to complete that 1% that the future generations have helped us with in terms of the 99. So let's talk about what is polio. It's a virus. How does one get polio? So basically, it's a virus that's transmitted person to person, and we try to show the fact that basically it's a fecal oral transmission. So basically, it travels from the stool sample of mostly children to other children by the way of contamination. And when you're in areas of low sanitation, hygiene, water, whatnot, the feces will then get mixed in with your water, your food, child's hands, their toys, and then end up in their mouth. And so that's the easiest way of transmission of polio. And what happens is that these symptoms will last even when the child doesn't know they have polio. Within 1 to 2 weeks, they can still be infecting others. And within the stool, it can last for many weeks and still infect others. So it can be in sewage samples in many cities. And so this is the easiest way that it transmits. And you can see a picture on the side. These are the kinds of areas that we work in. We're not just slums, but besides remote areas where the trash is not collected, or you go into, different neighborhoods where this is a norm because these are the only means that they can live in. So many diseases exist there, but polio definitely has a way of surging and emerging in these places. So we like to say that, the thing about polio that people don't realize is that when you get polio, most people are silent carriers of it. So you may get flu-like symptoms or no symptoms at all, and only 1 in 200 cases actually turns into paralysis. And what happens is that virus then enters your bloodstream, it attacks your nervous system, and then basically it inactivates your muscles so that they no longer have placidity. So your arms or your legs all of a sudden become flaccid in a way that you're not able to use. And so we've had different forms of some people, having this happen right away, and with some children it takes a while. But basically, when we know that 1 in 200 cases happened, we know that there's an epidemic, because everybody else is a silent carrier could have infected so many others. And so that's when we become our sampling. That's when we start testing the areas around and figuring out what else has happened. Who else can we start to address right now to make sure and start protecting all the other neighborhoods so that nobody else can get this in the coming weeks if they're very highly susceptible. So in terms of our Global Polio Eradication Initiative, I just want to show you over the years, we've been able to avert 8 million deaths or paralyzations since 1988 in terms of the initiative. And I just want to show the communications that we've had along the way. And so, these are across countries, how people have really stepped up to make sure that people understand what happens when you do get polio and how important it is to avoid this. And, and Barry touched upon this before, but one of the things that I love about our program is we are the most marketed public health initiative in the world. So when I was in India, I would always like to say that we're more far-reaching than Nike or Coca-Cola. So you would be able to see, I would have signs up in milk booths in the most remote areas of India. We have partnerships with every type of communication company, logistics company, to make sure that a parent knew when a vaccination was about to happen and that they knew what the dangers of polio were. So they would come out and make sure that they had the access to that service. So these are just some of the signs of things that are, posters that have come along the way, which I think are, have changed over time in terms of people's understanding. So we're talking about the endemic countries. Our 3 countries which are endemic are Nigeria, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. And then we're looking at what happens when you don't end the endemic, circulation of polio. You end up getting infections. Because of such a globalized world we live in, the virus will travel, and it'll travel easily. It'll travel over migration patterns. It'll travel across the plane. I mean, the ease of which it travels in terms of sewage samples. I'm sure you've heard of, a polio virus sample being found in Brazil during the World Cup in the sewage sample. How did that happen? It came from Central Africa. So you really think about how easy it is to be infected, and then the outbreak response that happens as a result. So usually after an outbreak happens in the country, we get on the ground, and within 6 months, we try to address the need so it doesn't spread any further. And then we address everything that's a risk alongside. So these are some of the measures that we take in terms of being able to make sure that the world is contained. And where we're standing right now is that we're at the brink of having a polio-free Africa. So now that we're able to get India to become polio-free, we're so close now to having a polio-free Africa, which is one step closer to making sure that we're on our path to having the world eradicated of polio by 2018. So I just want to talk to you about what UNICEF does, because this seems like a great program, but what are we responsible for? We're responsible for the most important things in terms of the program, which is the vaccine itself. The supply of the vaccine which is the heart of the program. How do we make sure that the vaccine actually gets delivered to all the children? Last year alone, we delivered 1.4 billion vaccines, and that's across the world. And so not only do we have to worry about the countries that actually are endemic to polio, we have to make sure that everybody else gets the vaccine so they sustain their immunization levels. Their immunity is at a high. So over $200 million. So this is where support's going. Imagine that one vial of vaccine is 15 cents. So to be able to vaccinate 76 countries and to be able to give the kinds of doses that we're looking at, and we'll go into that a little bit, it's enormous. We're looking at 406 million doses in Nigeria to make sure that we can raise an immunity level. So it's not the one dose that each one of us gets as a child and a booster. In Nigeria and in Pakistan, sometimes we have to vaccinate twice a month the same group of children, because we don't know sometimes the child has diarrhea and the vaccine doesn't stay in their stomach, and we don't know what their living circumstances are all the time, especially with a lot of children on the move. Are they around contaminated water? What are their water and hygiene sanitation practices? So to ensure that we can make sure that their immunity rates are high and that there will be less of a susceptibility to be able to get the virus. So these are the practices we have to take on, and as a result, 90% of UNICEF's procurement supports the program itself. And then the rest, that 10%, is for the rest of the countries. And the countries themselves also support in terms of buying, especially the developed countries in terms of supporting their vaccine supply. So what we do is we influence the market. We translate the demand forecast. So WHO comes and tells us, Nigeria is going to need 400 million doses. So we have to make sure 3 years in advance that we're working with the 4 suppliers that exist right now who are qualified, and make sure that each one of them knows how much they can produce, and then start that whole chain of process and make sure it's delivered on time for every vaccination campaign that takes place. So our biggest job in that is that there should be no delay. A parent shouldn't come to us and say, my child wasn't able to be vaccinated because you didn't have the vaccine available at that health clinic. So we want that never to happen. We work with the governments to make sure that distribution is taking place, that there's a cold chain. Many times when we come into a country, cold chain doesn't even exist. I was just working in outbreak response in Equatorial Guinea, and before we came in with the polio program, there were not even cold chain boxes. So you can imagine the levels of health systems that exist, to the point of completely dysfunctional to not existing. So what do we do to make sure that not only do we support polio, but we support vaccines and cold chain and broader routine immunization as a whole? So we're actually strengthening and actually creating a health system in many circumstances. So this is just to give you a sense of the doses that we've procured. 50 million doses are going into many of the countries that are not endemic with polio, but are at a risk. And then we go into our outbreaks, and we see, it says the millions of doses. So we've got 211 million doses just in the Horn of Africa because we had a large outbreak there last year. 306 million doses. This is just over 1 year period of time. 460 in Nigeria. So that gives you a sense of, the enormity and the complexity of the operation of just supply, and UNICEF is completely responsible for that. And so we go into what we were discussing in terms of challenges. And people forget, because it arrives at your doorstep, you forget about the high product sensitivity, the limited supply, and the long production time. And so what's next? We take care of the supply of the vaccine, but that's only half of the job. You can bring a vaccine to somebody's door, but if they don't accept the vaccine, if they don't trust the vaccine, they don't know who you are. So I like to say we're the largest public health program because we go door to door. There's no other health service in the world that goes door to door. So imagine we're knocking on a parent's door and we're offering them the polio vaccine, but they come to us and they say, nobody else comes to us for anything else. How did you even find out that we exist? How did you track our migration patterns? Because I'm a refugee that travels from, state to state. Or how did you know that I have 5 children? So what we do is we work on the ground with the community very closely. So the last thing we want to say is this is a Western program that's coming in to help you. We're saying this is a community-driven program. We've realized that you need some help in terms of being able to address this disease, and we are going to help support, build capacity within your community so that you can address this on your own, and we can be that support system that can exist. And then have an exit strategy. And that's what we try to do. So our global approaches have really been to understanding the operational and social challenges. Now, when you're at the end, that last 1% of eradicating a disease, you're at that 1% that everybody else has forgotten about. That 1% where conflict is so great that people don't want to enter into these places. We're talking about Nigeria that's beholden by Boko Haram. Now at its highest, charismatic state, they like to say. We're talking about Pakistan and KP and Fatah, which basically is around the border of Afghanistan, and that one block area where the refugee situation and the instability is greater than we've seen anywhere else. And then we look at the outbreak situations that have resulted. In Somalia, where we've got to be so secretive about who we work with because we're scared about what will happen with the NGOs, and nobody has access. When, Doctors Without Borders pulled us out of Somalia, we still didn't, because we still had work to do. So it's telling you we're in circumstances that barely anybody else wants to be in. And that's the only way to be able to get to the end of this disease. So we looked at unpacking, why areas are operationally challenged, limited access, and then adapting our strategies to make sure that we can address those needs there. And then we look at assessing the trust in the program, in the vaccine itself, and in our frontline workers, and making sure that the people that are coming to deliver the vaccine to you are also the people that are coming to you to talk to you about health as a whole. They're talking to you about what's beneficial for your child, what's beneficial for your community, what's beneficial for generations to come, so that you know that it's not just about the vaccine and checking that box, but that they care about your welfare, and they would do the same for their child. Many times, our greatest advocates are those whose children have gotten polio because they didn't allow them to get vaccinated. So they've become fervent supporters. They will make sure to knock on everybody's door and say, we have this great story in Nigeria of a woman named Aisha, and she said, my daughter got polio because nobody realized that I had an additional child in the house. And I didn't make a point of vaccinating her. So every time she goes into a neighborhood, she knows the name of every single child in every house because she doesn't want that child to be, in the same situation her child was. This is the kind of motivation that we have with us, which empowers us to do what we do. Without that, we would never be as close as we are right now. So we take that forward and promote the local ownership. And this is a campaign that we did in Afghanistan. And it basically says, polio is my responsibility. Vaccinating against polio is something that I need to do. And the faces are of a mother, of a school teacher. And these are all the people that are part of our program. And this is why, it is trusted. And this is why we're able to make gains in areas where no one else has access. We have backdoor conversations with the Taliban and with the government who do not participate in other conversations because they know that they want to protect their children. They want to be responsible for the generations to come and not seen as someone that didn't take that on. So, that's a huge advantage to us to be able to, focus on the whole child and look at, health centers and promoting broader child health services as a whole. So in India, what we did, and I led this national communication campaign the last 2 years, which changed what we were doing in the past. So no longer was it eradicate against polio, it was polio plus. How do I give my child complete protection? So how do we start talking about breastfeeding, water and sanitation? How do we make sure that we do diarrhea prevention as well? So when we come to your house, we also bring vitamin A. We talk about NEX. We talk about everything else that comes in, and we bring in books with the community health workers so we can explain what are the processes and what do you need to do. How you should be demanding services by your government. How your health center should have these aspects to take care of your child's health and your maternal health as well. So what we do on the ground, we like to say no one likes to, be told what to do by strangers, not any of us as well. So the key that we've been saying is developing this trust. And this key is community leaders. And I think when we're looking at what's happening in Ebola and, the lessons learned that are taken from polio onto many other diseases, is that not only is it our training of community health workers, which really worked in Nigeria and other areas as well, it's the ability to be able to utilize community leaders to speak out, to be able to talk about why it's important, converting refusals, generating demand. So we use for this, a number of different people from our social networks, our ambassadors, local icons, teachers, religious and traditional leaders. All of these factors have played a big role in us being able to have the presence that we do on the ground, for people to be able to be talking about polio more than they do about anything else. And so, as a result, we now have more access to children than we ever have had before. More access means more vaccinations, and that's one step closer to eradication globally. And I just want to talk about a few of the key things that have allowed us to do this. 1,500 religious leaders supporting the polio vaccinations, over 30 fathers. And the reason why I want to highlight this is that you've got to remember that polio is taking place in 3 predominantly Muslim countries. So Nigeria, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, if you don't have the fatwas in place and if you don't have the religious leaders, there is no way you're going to get national conversion. And that's been huge for us to realize. And what we're trying to push for other health services as well is that who are the key people that need to be involved? It's not just the doctors in the clinics. It's who in the community do you get involved? And how do you start promoting things like free mobile health clinics? Joint polio and sanitation interventions, advanced health camps providing free medications. And so these are, linkages with other child health interventions. Just some of the key things that we feel like have been able to change the face of the program, the face of being able to provide access to health, and what happens next. So what happens next is legacy. And basically, I'm going to stop with these slides so that I can talk through it a little bit more, is that when we talk about you've eradicated polio in India, you become polio-free, what happens next? Do you just end? Do you move on to another disease? What do? You've trained now thousands of health workers, and you don't want to just leave that ground and walk away and then walk to another country. We basically take that program and we transition those assets, both our HR assets, which are community health workers in the thousands, as well as our strategies. Our intangible assets, what are our strategies, our networks, our fundraising sources, how do we utilize all of these assets to then move on to other health goals and to broader health initiatives. So this is what we're calling our legacy planning, where we're sharing lessons, where we're trying to make sure that other programs benefit from what we've already done, so that we're laying the groundwork so that we can have stronger health systems as a whole. And that's what changes the face of the program, is that we've come in with this idea of polio. And I was mentioning this last night is that, there's so many reasons why I joined the program. And one of the reasons why I stayed in it, because you join for many reasons, and you stay in 6 years because you realize that when you open that door in the most inaccessible areas, you're opening the door to a child's identity. And that door has got so many other doors behind it of so many other people that let you get there, from the health worker to the religious leader to whatnot. And all of a sudden, that child has a face. And it has a face not only in terms of health services, it has a face in the community. It has a face in terms of programming. It has a face in terms of child rights. It has a face and identity that we recognize it's another child that is our responsibility to take care of. And until polio goes door to door, it's really difficult to reach that every last child. It's difficult to get momentum and initiative and motivation for people to start tracking the children that are being missed, start going to the areas that are not being counted, that we're saying is too difficult. So we want to say that we're not just eradicating a disease, we're eradicating the excuses to reach every last child. To be able to say that we don't have what it takes to make sure that every child has access to services. Every child can be free of polio because within our means and within the means of this generation. And that every child should have the right to live a healthy life and be productive and, be able to experience and make the decisions that each one of us has been able to have. So, that's, I think, the beauty of this program. That's the beauty of being able to say that we are part of this effort to make sure that the communities then recognize that there's a number of layers behind us, supporting us, making sure that they count, they're visible, they matter. So that's our polio program. Thank you. I want to give you a chance. I may have gone through this a little bit quickly, but I wanted to give you a chance to be able to talk about what your questions are, what your concerns are in terms of the program or in terms of other health issues that align with polio. Do you want to know more? We've spoken a little bit about Ebola, but I wanted to say, and I mentioned this last night, which I think is really important, is that Ebola in Nigeria could have been a nightmare. You look at the vastness of Nigeria and you look at the districts and the difficulty, especially in the north, and the reason that it was it was able to be contained is that our emergency operations centers that exist across our endemic countries and in Nigeria were able to contain Ebola. It was the same people that stepped up, trained the health workers, were able to get on the ground and make sure that it didn't get further than it needed to, that people knew the best practices, that we were able to educate the population rapidly because we already had a network. So we're trying to do the same network types of trainings and practices across the rest of Western Africa right now through polio as a way of containing Ebola and being able to work forward in other diseases. So, yes. Absolutely. And I would never say it's because of UNICEF are successful. It's because of the organizational structures that were created there as a result of the polio program, which was heavily supported by CDC, heavily supported by the Gates Foundation, WHO, whatnot that came together. The reason I highlight Nigeria specifically is because we were able to develop this Emergency Operations Center, EOC, which in our endemic countries we utilize as kind of like a war room, and it's like a center where we really address the immediate needs and we'll be able to tackle what needs to happen. And because that was an endemic and that existed there with a workforce of community health workers, we were able to respond much more quickly. Now, the same didn't exist in neighboring countries because those assets, once they did train for polio, were transitioned onto other things, but sometimes the community health worker populations were very small. So what we were trying to do is use the same skill set in other places, working with all local groups. So in certain areas where we don't have UNICEF staff, in some of our outbreaks, we rely entirely on local NGOs. In Somalia, it's completely local NGOs. Those are all that we rely on in terms of working. And we're working with MSF, we're working with the World Food Program. We work with as many partners on the ground. And the beauty of UNICEF's history is that it has such strong relationships with the government since its inception to local organizations that it's developed a level of trust on the ground as well. And that's been able to help the process. Now, in West Africa, the process is a little slower. I mean, UNICEF is on the ground with community care centers and trying to train and trying to do as much of the replication process as well. But because we didn't have those workforces in place that were as advanced as the ones in polio, we didn't get the same kind of quick results as we had in Nigeria. Not necessarily because there's a large HIV population, but any time that we have an issue with low immunity, we end up with populations that are a bit more compromised in terms of our vaccine. But we haven't necessarily noticed that because of that, we're getting a circulating vaccine-derived virus or whatnot. So there's two vaccines. There's the oral vaccine and there is the inactivated vaccine, which is the injection, right? And what we're trying to do in terms of our eradication efforts is that we are using both right now to create a large amount of immunity and then phasing out the oral, the attenuated vaccine, because there is a chance, a very small likelihood, but there's still a likelihood of getting the virus through that oral attenuated weakened virus. So the goal is to eventually phase that out and only use the inactivated, the injection across the world. And that will be enough to maintain immunity once we get to that point.
For babies that are born, do you look at these
Exactly. We do the same. So we would do this tracking, and we would know in the community. So depending on hospital births or home births or whatnot, we would know all the pregnant women in advance. We'd go visit their houses. I would have a track sheet. You come into a community and you have a community map, right? And the community map tells you how many women are pregnant, how many children do they have, who lives where's the religious leader, where's the teacher, whatnot. And we would go door to door, and I would always visit the pregnant women first, the women that just delivered. And then we would immediately talk about breastfeeding, vaccinations, whatnot. So if there's a whole tracking process of making sure, always encouraging hospital births, but then if there was home deliveries, then what would we do next?
I'm interested in how this program really works in areas where
No, absolutely. I think it's a really important question. We have access advisors, access and security advisors that are on board with the program over the last few years, and they specifically go in and assess our security risks. And we have a whole program on political advocacy that specifically works on access. So there's a lot of backdoor conversations that happen, and we have to work in the areas of conflict. So we're actively playing a role in Iraq in the midst of things that are going on in Pakistan, in Syria. I mean, in Syria, we had both sides help us with the vaccine. So, and these are conversations we're just not allowed to have out loud. And so everybody's playing a critical role. We wouldn't even be able to deliver the vaccine if it wasn't those that were involved in a situation to some extent, helping us or creating some type of ceasefire for a day, or figuring out a route, or protecting our workers to some extent, always. So, and this is a strategy that's being developed further, and they're trying to assess with the assistance of neighboring countries who are seen as, as helpful to that country or whatnot. So as I was saying last night, the UAE has really become a big force with us and really helpful in the context of Pakistan, and really supportive in terms of making sure they can help us protect our healthcare workers and what they can do in the face of, the situation that's taking place in the Northwest frontier, and making sure that there's also another Muslim voice. So, balancing out that context as well. I think our biggest challenge is access more than people. Because you would be surprised how many ways they can discuss the vaccine and its need to people, especially when they see the person next to them is child gets polio, and especially when that person turns into a parent. And we've had so many conversions of religious groups, so many conversions of the most fervent. I mean, from, DRC to Nigeria. I've seen the process of so many people stepping in, and people you wouldn't even imagine that would step in to come support and have a conversation with that person. So that, for me, I feel like is surmountable, because I feel like person-to-person kind of communication, if you've got the right people in the room, the right people addressing it, changes situations. And sometimes people will just take longer. And there's some people that if we cannot address them, we can address everybody around the community. And that's what we work on. But for me, I think access. Access is probably our most difficult challenge, and that is our strategy for this year. It's a big focus. So for 2015, this is the low season. And the low season runs into the summer, and then you've got the summers when you really get the high rate of infections. And the low season is when you use every single strategy possible, because you want to build the immunity to the point that when you get to high season, everybody's strong. This is the most critical low season, and Pakistan is our most critical country. So we had 42 cases last year. And out of those 342 cases, 291 were in Pakistan. So that tells you, if we address Pakistan, we're almost there. We had 416 cases the year before, so we're already getting there. But it's the geopolitical context that we work in that sometimes is out of our control, and it's changing. And so what can we do? We just start building relationships and figuring out what to do. I mean, it's a context in Pakistan when the Prime Minister is changing every year, and you keep meeting with the Prime Minister, and then you want to build on the gains. It's a little hard sometimes. But how do you have the neighboring countries aid supporters? So it's a lot of the donor governments who are big supporters, they're putting their development aid agencies with their trade as well now. That's been a big shift across many countries. So how do you have that trade perspective now be a point of, bargaining that you can start utilizing? So that kind of political advocacy, how do you have, France speak to one of our French-speaking Central African countries and say, this is what needs to happen. And if you're not taking care of your children, our aid is going to cut like this. How do you start having these tough conversations? Because that's sometimes the only way you have left to be able to change the situation. So we're trying to think as out of the box as possible. We're always welcome to innovative solutions, but we try to, incorporate as many different people. We've had brain trust meetings of saying, how do we start localizing our solutions? How do we make sure we address this cultural need, and especially in Pakistan, that's very relevant, so that we can address why they think this is something they don't want. How do we create demand in this specific situation? And what's interesting about this is that so many of our programs are so broad in general is that people don't have the luxury to be able to do that to some extent.
So there was this sort of unity of 10 years ago, because in the United States, we don't need vaccines, nobody's getting sick, they never see it.
Yeah.
Which really, so in some ways, when people don't see the return on time, I assume there was some effort from doctors and some of those that come here, but I think that's a really
absolutely. I thought that Jenny McCarthy was there. Well, the whole website on Anjali McCarthy's done. Which is unfortunate. We try to counter. So what's interesting about that is that when somebody says at a certain level, we try to find somebody equally at that level to debunk. And that's the best way in terms of communication. So figuring out how the country can address this. But unfortunately, the right to choose works against us. And that's why you've got measles outbreaks in the south of the U.S. and you've got whooping cough in the northwest and whatnot. And luckily, polio won't come back as quickly as any of those. But hopefully that's a wake up and a reminder. And what we try to do is that we try to have as many people speak up as possible from as many different backgrounds. And so as many mothers and fathers and leaders to really say why this is relevant and important. And how it really, your child is not able to make this decision, so please don't take that away from them. And we like to say they turn into parasites, and so how do we start changing that conversation? And we're really working hard. We had this unfortunate circumstance where one of our celebrity ambassadors, he put out a piece on vaccinations, and he got, ridiculed by the anti-vaccine lobby, to the point where he came back to us and he's like, I can't do anymore. And we just think, wow, this is the state that we're in, and so how do we combat that with, stronger people, more messages, different ways of being able to tackle this, so that it's working. It completely we just become smarter in terms of what we do. We don't engage in the debate with them whatsoever. We have our own conversation, because once you engage with them, then you lose half of, half of the intellect that's going on here. So, yeah. That's true. Yeah. Yes, we do, absolutely. So now India's transitioning into measles, which is really exciting because when they're looking at eliminate measles and whatnot and how close they're getting to the 2020 goal, they expect that region to be the next. And so we're very supportive of the measles effort. We try to do a lot of complementary measles services. So you've got to remember what happens in many countries is that the supply doesn't always exist. I'm talking about this enormous supply of polio because we've made sure that you have polio everywhere you need it. That's not always the case for the other diseases, right? So if there is a vaccine available for something else and we're already providing cold chain, we always try to do complementary, coupling of services and whatnot, and try to make sure when they have vaccination days that, both happen at the same time and whatnot. So that's something that we've been documenting more and trying to show. Like I always try to, figure out evidence-based ways of saying, because of what's happening with polio, routine immunization rates have increased. Because of what's happening, people have more access to water and sanitation services. They have more access to primary health care centers, whatnot. So these are the kinds of things we feel like would help quantify to others the impact that they're having. Yeah. We do. So I never like to say it because you don't know, how things get delayed, but we're really hoping to halt transmission by the end of 2015 or beginning of 2016. So we really, for us, having a polio-free Africa this year is completely within sight, which is huge for us. And to be able to take one continent and Africa, considering the outbreaks, considering the situation, it's a huge win. And then we're really going to just hone in on Pakistan. And so 2018, by the end of 2018 is really what we're hoping that we can achieve this goal. So we're really excited about how close it is. Yeah. U.S. plays a huge role. Huge. It's one of our biggest funders, period. And CDC is amazing. And a huge funder. And but what happens is that, and CDC would love this, and we can have another conversation about it, is that money gets stuck in Congress. And this is the problem, is that there is money allocated, but it's stuck. USAID has come to me and said the same thing. It said, millions of dollars stuck in Congress that I can't get out and help support your programs. So it limits. So these are the kinds of advocacy pieces that we're doing with Rotary and whatnot to get on the Hill and to have these conversations. And so we go to Washington several times every year to have these conversations to figure out who else do we need to advocate for, what buttons do we need to push, what needs to happen. Absolutely. No, but I'm very proud of the U.S.'s involvement in this. They played a key role. Carry on. Absolutely. So for a country to have their last case, you need 3 years after that for there to be no cases to be considered polio-free. That's the whole certification process. And in that point, there's numerous amounts of testing that are going on to ensure that that's done. And the vaccine will still exist there. So the idea is not to get rid of the vaccine whatsoever. It's the number of vaccinations and whatnot will decrease. So you still have your general, 1 to 2 times a year, like in India, they're still having their national campaigns. It's not the state-focused campaigns. So in those national campaigns, we will still vaccinate 170 million kids. But before we used to focus 55 million kids a month, every single month, trying to hit the target. So it'll just lessen to being less, to less frequent more than anything else. But the idea is that until the world becomes polio-free and you have the injectable, you are not going to get rid of the vaccine. You start phasing it out. There was a couple of hands, and I just did it. Yeah. So what we're we're doing is legacy, so we're actually doing transition planning. So right now in the MOOC, we're actually developing transition guidelines. And this process is that how do we get the governments involved to say your current assets portfolio, tangible and intangible, what do we start moving on toward? Can we ask the governments this? What are your health priorities? And we have to look at it really from country to country and understand, what's not functioning or what do you need assistance with or what can we actually decide are going to be your goals. And this is what we help them put together. Like, it's really like a manual, a guidance tool that I'm after working on over the weekend. And basically working on what to do next and how do we support this and how do we fund this out and transition it out so it can support broader services. That's our goal. That's our goal with all of our countries. We're even trying to do this legacy and actual right now. In Nigeria, we're trying to even still do this, but how do we start thinking about the future so that we don't get caught, at a place when we've already finished that we don't know what to do. So what are the strategies in place right now to make sure that we can start addressing these roles of broader regionalization?
I'm the managing director of the New England region, US. Also, thank you for speaking today. And I can say, I know many of you saw this speak last night, but I can say that Alana, Ryan, and I saw her speak this past summer. We were absolutely floored. I think the information she shared, her confidence and commitment, and an overwhelming certainty that we can and will eradicate polio worldwide. The certainty really is that the data and decades of experience. And actually learning, but to see it and to hear it is so inspiring to know that we really can do it. We really can balance the tools needed and the commitment to see that effort through. And I want to thank you for seeing this through and for sharing that with us. As many of you know, I'm the UNICEF group and I say it every time I'm up here, and it's true. That's why I say it every time. But this is what really makes the work of UNICEF so exciting to me and so amazing to me personally. UNICEF isn't afraid to do difficult things that will protect children and their families worldwide. And really, if you think about it, the idea of eradicating the disease of the world, eliminating a disease, getting rid of it, is truly historic, amazing. And truly, the second time in our history is phenomenal, and we are so close to being done. As you heard Anjali to say, we had 342 cases last year, when in the 40s and 50s we had 35,000 a year in the U.S. alone. It's amazing progress, and we are that close. What also excites me about this polio eradication effort is while we're tackling a truly horrible disease, UNICEF and partners such as Rotary International, Partners in God, Doctors Without Borders, and the World Health Organization are building sustainable health systems throughout the world in countries that haven't really had a health system before. To learn to trace and track ethics of polio and to know who's received the also vaccine, health workers, doctors, policymakers, NGOs, and governments have to work together to make that system work. The second point is UNICEF always asking, and then what? We will eradicate polio, and then what happens in those communities? If we only treat the polio without creating better systems, those communities' health and well-being does not advance as far as it might have otherwise. And this has really far-reaching implications. As we saw in the Philippines this fall when another typhoon made landfall, the systems that had been taking place after Typhoon Haiyan last year, they were stronger, the people and their leaders were better prepared, and the storm this time from that place, the impact of the storm was far less than last year's storm. As we saw in Nigeria last fall, the health system was built to block polio ensure that a potential Ebola outbreak was stopped in its tracks. So while UNICEF partners are fighting Ebola in West Africa, to cover the immediate needs of children and their caregivers, answering the question, and then what, means that the care is given a system that will make the country stronger after this outbreak is over. That is truly the power of UNICEF and I'm so proud of your organization. One note about Ebola, I'm excited about. Here in New England, the Family Foundation has received $250,000 contracts to manage new and increased care for the efforts to protect children in these Ebola-affected countries. And we have until February 13th to complete the match. And I know that these are not major things. These gifts impact-based design for those countries. So we're very excited about having this opportunity to talk to them more about it. We want to model that. Switching gears. We have a very exciting spring coming up this year. First of all, I hope you can join us in April 2nd. That was amazing, wasn't it? I hope you can join us on April 2nd for our next speaker series event. She'll be here in this room. We'll be welcoming Carrie Rhodes, who's going to speak to us about another global effort to eradicate a disease, this time to eliminate maternal and neonatal deaths. This is another incredible partnering effort that UNICEF has undertaken, this time with Kiwanis and many other organizations. She's an amazing speaker. She's a really compelling story to tell, so I hope you can join us. I also wanted to say that in March and April, we prepared to see 6,000 Boston area children generating kid power. What that means is these events that many of the staff are running right now truly make it possible for a child in Massachusetts to get more active and literally save the life of a malnourished child in a developing country. Matt Myerson was excused back. It's nice that somebody might hear about it. Who's on our staff for the rest of the staff can tell you more about it, but be on the lookout. It's really going to be pretty cool. In closing, I want to thank and acknowledge our committee co-chairs, Barry Landry and Barbara Eisenson, for doing everything that they do to make this event so successful and for your sponsorship of the event again this year. I want to thank Susan Middlefield for sponsoring this event, and also to the Northern Twins Company who's providing additional support for us this year. Thank you. I want to thank as well the members of our series committee who are here today, and finally, really to thank you for taking the time to be here to learn about the work of UNICEF. Please enjoy the cookies and coffee. Feel free to stay warm today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.